Chapter 19. Zira, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Name: Aquila. Age: 68. Level: 20. Sealed. Race: Royal Divine Eagle. Title: Eagle God's Avatar. Attributes: Strength: 20. Endurance: 20. Speed: 13. Dexterity: 12. Intelligence: 24. Luck: 5. Sub-attributes: Stamina: 85 85 MP 240/240 Swiftness: 74. Agility: 37. Senses: 69. ATR Cap 94. Attack: 115. Defense: 80. Magic Attack: 72. MP Regen: 1.2 per minute. Proficiencies: Flight, LV Max, Plunge, LV Max, Mana Control, LV.7, Magic Skills: Wind Magic, LV.7, equals, Tempest, T.8, Jade Rouse, T.9, Wind Blade, T.10, Earth Magic, LV.4, equals, Quake, T.9, Anchor, T.10, Cognitive Skills, Passive: Far Sight, LV.7. A vision unbothered by distance or speed. It is said that this skill allows the user to catch molecular and subsonic movements from thousands of kilometers away at its highest levels. Spontaneous Skills, Active: Scan, LV.6. The most common analytic skill provided by the system. Its biggest downside is that it cannot scan higher-level targets and is easily countered by hosts possessing a higher-grade skill of the same nature, appraisal included. At-Spool, LV.3. Rapid Take. Off. The time needed to take flight is reduced to nearly a second. Cost: 5 Stamina. Unique or racial traits: Divine Vision. The user can see 2 seconds into the future and their perception range becomes 360 degrees at any time. Avatar of the Eagle God. Bound to the Eagle God statue. The avatar is also granted accelerated recovery while close to the statue. Note: Aquila is one of the divine envoys said to have been raised on a secret plateau of the system where the beings of divine nature captured by the yearly summons are rumored to live. This Aquila is merely a clone. Most of his attributes and skills are sealed by the system to match the seedling host's level. Scary stuff, Alan remarked as they ran through the forest. Yes, this doesn't look like something we can defeat in all honesty, Flavia added. Yeah, also, what are these things between brackets next to the magic skills? Magics, Rachna responded shortly while vaulting over a large root. Alan deadpanned, care to be a little more specific? They're stand-alone abilities. Alexa called them sub-magic skills and the number between parentheses represents their tier. She said that these magics had their own effects as well as their own magic attack multiplicator. Before you ask, my appraisal is too low to look at the specifics. So, for all we know, that tier 7 magic of his, Tempest, might be able to deal 300% magic damage or something. Pretty much, Rachna nodded impassively and Alan's sweat dropped. Dude, can we even get through his defense? At least I know I can't. Only the ability of my gloves would be remotely able to something. It's fine. I confirmed it before, defense is a relative value. It's not because your attack is too low that it will do nothing. At least until a certain threshold probably. Additionally, my attack is high enough, Rachna retorted and Alan sighed in defeat. This is why you want allies then, I see. Flavia nodded in understanding. Numbers will probably give us the edge we need to fight it. Rachna nodded and as he circled a tree, he heard a gunshot in the distance. Pronos turned his head toward the source with a contorted face. What's wrong? You don't like the sound? Alan asked when he noticed and the little snake hissed quietly before looking ahead again. Rachna glanced at his pet and hummed. He probably must have grown a dislike for it back at the research facility he was in. Research. Flavia started. Now that I think about it, before being taken here, you said you had an idea of where he came from, right? Yes. Tell me, have you two ever heard of a project called Zira? Zira. Can't say I have, Alan shook his head. What about you, Teach? Flavia took a contemplating expression before answering, I have gotten wind of it. If I'm not wrong, it was a project believed to be as potentially focal as the successful manufacture of ion nuclear heads. At least, that's what my grandfather told me when he was still an active general in Aurora. I have no idea of what it actually entails. Rachna nodded. Zira is an acronym for zoomorphic ion encroachment of reconstructed acid. A mouthful, I know. Let's say that its main goal was to use ion to restructure DNA in such a way that it would have the same propriety as ion systems. Wait, Alan spoke up. To be sure I'm understanding this right, by ion system, you mean the reaction of ion stones. Correct. As you both know, more than 100 years ago, we discovered the very first two ion stones and found out they produced ion energy when close to each other. Since then, we've managed to replicate them to have unlimited energy wherever we wanted. My cigarette case, for example, has two miniature stones to power up the lighter. The Zira project took this concept even a step higher, Rachna said while sending a look at Pronos. They wanted to create a biological agent capable of transforming cells into ion poles and thus allow humans to borderline become superhumans with not only the ability to alimент pretty much any device imaginable by just touching it but also gain powers like inhuman strength, inhuman vitality, increased longevity, and ion manipulation. It was said that the establishment of the Zira project was the closest humans ever got to actual magic. Wow. I guess that never happened then. Alan remarked. Unless there are supermen back at home and I had no idea. No, you're right. It never happened. As stated in the name, the project only involved experiments on animals and although it worked a few times, there was a 99.9% chance for a subject to die. When it was concluded that it was impossible to better these odds, they gave up altogether. After all, no one was really willing to try and see if they were the lucky ones. Not even mentioning the still untested potential effects it could have on humans. I see. So, what you're trying to say is that Pronos is one of those survivors? Flavia inquired. Yes. As provided by the system, he's an ion snake. Increased physical and mental capabilities plus a very terrifying manipulation of ion poison, Rachna affirmed with an unmoved face. That's why he must hate gunshots. The injection would sometimes cause an animal to go berserk and they would have to be put down. He must have seen some of his fellow subjects suffer that fate. Pronos lowered his head and almost seemed to be crying. Everyone stayed silent for a short moment for his sake. Still, I'm still shocked, to be honest, Alan broke the silence with a light tone. I would have never expected something as crazy as that might have actually been possible for humans. Well, are you curious to know what inspired this project? The inspiration, you say? Flavia tilted her head. Yes. There was one man who got very close to be that sort of superhuman. That certain man got his chest blasted by an ion system which accidentally and quite unbelievably, got stuck to his heart without killing him. It gave him inhuman physical and recovery abilities. But, to use that superpower, because of the weakened version of the system he got implanted, he needed an external influx of ion that would, let's say, kickstart the engine. Damn, that must have been a pretty scary guy. Rachna would have smirked if he could. You've met him, Alan. Ha. You too, Flavia. You both knew him pretty well in fact. Flavia's eyes widened. There's no way, the old master was a superhuman. Alan exclaimed. Holy shit, no wonder he was so damn strong for a guy over 100 years old. I suddenly feel better about all the beatings I received, Rachna snorted and Flavia wryly smiled but inwardly, she was thinking hard. She stared at the back of her arguably favorite student and frowned. Aurora took over 90 years ago. There is no one who doesn't know how the organization threatened every country in the world with its monopoly over ion nukes. But, the main factor to their success was their leader. The same man that people would call a demon and who would appear uninvited in enemies' houses only to leave a sea of corpses behind. Never caught, never beaten. He even once survived an explosion large enough to raise an entire building. She squinted her eyes. Exactly like a superhuman, the familiar smirking face of a terrifyingly intelligent and unnaturally fit old man popped in her head. It can't be, can it? Fire. A shout pierced through their conversation and the trio stopped in their tracks. Several gunshots followed and one could hear the cries of goblins and eagles mixed in. At some point, even the sound of an explosion echoed through the forest. Alan clicked his tongue. Explosives too, huh? I guess the temptation was too big for mere students. Most of them probably bought firearms from the shop. Well, most kids are like that, Rachna commented. You speak as if you weren't one, Flavia jested. Does one need to be a woman to tell another that he is a man? Sorry, I'm not sure I get what you're trying to say. Rachna paused. Never mind. Guns aside, explosives aren't a bad idea. I should have bought some as well. Anyway, let's head toward the fighting, he stated and kicked the ground. At the same time, he whistled and several shadows around the forest moved. Asterisk asterisk asterisk, I hate my luck, Lays cursed as he drew his katana and placed it back in its sheath as two goblin heads spun in the air. He then rapidly rolled on the ground to dodge a massive club swung by a massive version of a goblin wearing leather armor. That makes two of us, Leia added and tried to hit the large monster with her hammer only for it to be grabbed bare-handed. Shit, she cursed and let go of her weapon before using it as a foothold to retreat. Watch out, a calm voice announced and Leia looked over her shoulder with a scowl. An arrow then flew past her cheek and pierced the monster's eye. Error. The green-skinned creature roared in pain and dropped the hammer in his hand as it began to wildly swing its weapon, smashing both goblins and a few unfortunate eagles. The fuck, Dan? Leia shouted at a tree where the one who shot the arrow was perched on. You could have killed me with that. But I didn't. How is that a valid excuse? Calm down, Lele, the well-built man of the gang said as he lifted a shield to confront the enemy. Shut up, Gant. Don't call me, Lele. She shouted back before rushing back toward the monster and grabbing her hammer back while it was occupied trying to get past the shield's defense. Lays also sneaked behind it and attempted to slash its neck, but before his blade could reach it, the oversized goblin crouched and rammed Gant's shield with his shoulder. Gant winced because of the shock that was transferred to his arm. He clicked his tongue and buried his feet in the ground. Boss. This isn't going anywhere. He's right. This thing's a level 10 hobgoblin, with the armor, his defense is nearly 50. I get it. Lays replied and jumped back. Forget about saving up, everyone. Fire. At his order, the whole gang fished out the firearms they had bought and fired with an uncanny proficiency for a group of students. The hobgoblin immediately crossed its arms and crouched to protect its head and heart. Throw the grenades. Lays ordered and several members threw their explosives at the monster. When the explosions occurred, they heard the hobgoblin roar before it was drowned in the sound of detonations. Soon afterward, everyone had emptied their magazines and the bullets stopped. Is it over? One member stuttered. Lays raised an eyebrow at the cloud of smoke and after a good moment of silence, everyone started relaxing. Then, the smoke suddenly moved unnaturally and Lays shuddered. Don't relax. It's not dead yet. Even before he could finish his sentence, the hobgoblin had already started rushing toward the closest target it could find. Leia paled as she saw the burned face of the hobgoblin charging at her and tried to lift her hammer. But she would obviously not do it in time. Leia. The second the hobgoblin was in range, she closed her eyes in fear and braced for what was about to come. But nothing of the sort happened, and instead, she heard the monster roar in fury. She opened her eyes again, and the sight of two wolves gnawing onto the hobgoblin's wrists was presented to her. Just after, a shadow leaped over the hobgoblin and landed on its head. "Why don't you take a nap?" She heard this shiver-inducing voice and then watched as exactly 10 weird thin blade-like objects pierced the monster's head with an audible sound of bones breaking and flesh being stabbed. The shadow jumped off from the hobgoblin's head and landed on the ground at the same time as the corpse fell. Chapter 20. The Piano and the Puppy. You are listening at novelfull.audio. LV.10 Hobgoblin killed. You have dealt the final blow. 100% of experience acquired. Requirement for level up updated. Current progress. 20/80ths. Rachna flicked the blood off his claws, then looked at the remaining goblins nearby. "Scram," he uttered, and triggered his intimidation at the same time. The green-skinned monsters screeched and bolted away without looking back. Rachna looked in the direction where they were running to and managed to catch a glimpse of the school grounds from the gaps in the tree's branches. "Leia. You're okay." Lays ran to his sister and Rachna looked at them. At the same time, Flavia and Alan arrived and walked to him. "Damn, man, you're too fast," Alan grumbled as he looked at the corpse of the hobgoblin on the ground. He glanced at its head and saw the 10 small puncture marks before sniggering. I'm fine." "Geez," Leia stood up while pushing away the people next to her with a huff. Leia sighed in relief and turned toward Rachna. "Thank you, Ziora. I can't imagine what would have happened if you didn't intervene," he said. "No problem." "Hey," Alan raised his voice, catching everyone's attention. "Aren't you guys the wing walkers?" he inquired with a tilt of his head. Lays blinked in surprise. "Yes. I'm surprised you know about us." Alan shrugged. "I met that guy last year," he pointed at one of the members behind Lays, who pointed at himself in confusion. "Yeah, you. I never forget a face, or anything else for that matter. I was passing by when I heard your introduction. You all have the same tattoo as well, no need to be a genius to make the connection." "Wing walkers," Flavia muttered. "What is that?" "Some sort of organization." "A gang," Rachna, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Or to be exact, they're a bunch of military-trained orphans who roam the streets to fight the crime and help citizens." At his words, the entirety of the group in front of him stared at him wide-eyed. It was as if they had just heard something impossible. That's not something that should be known to the public," Dan uttered. "Where did you hear that?" "Not relevant," Rachna replied. Calm down," Lays put his hand in front of Dan, "there's no point in fighting here. Much less caring about that kind of stuff when we're not even sure to still be on Earth. Ziora, I guess you were not here just to say hi and save my sister, right?" Rachna nodded. "Correct. Let's say that I need allies, but for what?" He answered by pointing at Aquila perched on the statue. "To kill that thing." "Wait, I thought that gathering these souls was precisely for us to leave without fighting that eagle," Gant frowned. "Are you saying that it's wrong?" "Actually, we can't say for sure," Lays refuted with thoughtful expression. "The mission prompt said that gathering 50 souls would open the exit. As for the failing case, those with less will die after time runs out." "Indeed," Rachna nodded. "From that perspective, that eagle is either a blatant threat to people who do not gather enough souls in time or a simple guardian. I lean toward the latter. The system told us that those with less than 50 souls would die, with a wording that left no debate. However, I checked that bird's attributes." "What?" Dan was surprised. "How?" "I tried as well, but my scan was nullified." Rachna glanced at him indifferently. Try to use it on me. On you. The spectacled teen scowled but nonetheless cast his skill. A prompt instantly gave him a result that startled him. Scan failed. Target possesses a higher grade of analyzing skills. That's why, Rachna said and continued on without waiting for an answer. In any case, Aquila, that eagle, is powerful for sure, but nearly not enough to kill every participant without fail. Additionally, this is a hunt against its own race. The souls might actually be needed to get through the exit, but I don't think that the eagle god's avatar would let us go happy merry after we've murdered hundreds of its kin. Aren't you overthinking it? Leia commented. When she spoke, Rachna looked at her and she briefly blushed but covered it up with a cough. I mean, this is a sort of game quest, right? I don't think it goes that deep. That's where you're wrong, it was Flavia who retorted her argument. We have to take this seriously exactly because it's not a game. This is real life. No matter how close to a game you think this is, you can't just go off that thinking. Didn't your shopkeeper tell you? This system is full of people like us, who were suddenly abducted. She's right, Rachna followed and looked over his shoulder to stare at Aquila. It's very likely that the bird over there is an actual divine being from a place like our world. Something that was not created but someone who was taken in by the system. This is the reason why we can't think of this as a game. Everyone fell silent until a member of Wing Walkers lifted his hand awkwardly. I have a small question. Rachna looked at him. Where do these come from? He pointed at two gray wolves who were silently sitting on the side, wagging their tails. Wait, they're the ones who stalled the hobgoblin earlier. Leia finally remembered that just before Rachna came to kill the monster, it had been attacked by wolves. You're asking good questions, Alan laughed. I too have no idea. Same here, Flavia added, and everyone turned to Rachna, who casually brought his fingers to his lips and whistled for the wolves to leave. It's related to my Nirvana skill, he ultimately said after they had left. Nirvana skills, huh? Lays repeated. How did you awaken it? I have one, I think, but it's marked unknown on my status and my AI isn't giving me any definite answer. I can't say. Personally, mine awakened when I was about to die, Rachna said impassively, and Lays cringed a little bit. Don't worry. I really don't think that near-death experiences are the only way to unlock them. For instance, Flavia had hers available almost immediately. I see, so, what do you think of my suggestion? Rachna asked. Can I rely on your group? I believe that I can't find anyone more competent than any of you in our school. You might be surprised, Lays snickered. There are black horses everywhere after all. I met one a few moments ago, in fact. Rachna raised an eyebrow and he chuckled. In any case, I accept your proposal. Looking forward to work with you, he said while extending his hand. Likewise, Lays Walker, Rachna said and shook his hand. Lays bitterly smiled. Seems you do know something about our orphanage, that I do. Someone I know used to live there, Rachna explained and turned toward the school grounds from where he could already smell the auras of both the goblins and the eagles thanks to his wolf senses. I assume not all of you have gathered the quota, right? That's why you're here. Lays nodded. You're right. We still lack a few souls. Makes sense with so many people, Alan remarked nonchalantly. Yes, unfortunately. And I refuse to ever leave anyone behind, Lays replied firmly. His group smiled at his words as if they didn't expect any less from him. I see. You make a good leader, Rachna commented. Then, let's not waste any more time. First thing we need to do is to assess the situation. Who amongst you is the fastest and stealthiest? Dan raised his hand. That would be me. All right. You and me will go scout the school grounds to see what we can expect. Lays, you're fine with that? Lays nodded. No problem. We'll wait for you two to come back. In that case, let's go. We'll be sure to be back in less than 30 minutes, Rachna declared, and he and Dan nodded at each other before leaping on tree branches and vanishing inside the forest. Those two, their speed really doesn't look human anymore, Alan sighed. Well, the same could be said for any of our specializations, Lays added as everyone sat down, preparing to wait. This is just the tutorial, as they called it, and we're already becoming something that normal humans never could have imagined possible. I wonder how far we'll go like this. Who cares, come on, Leia said while lying on the ground with her hands behind her back. Do you really need to get existential for nothing? Lays snorted. I guess not. He then looked at Alan and Flavia. The former was leaning against a tree and the latter was sitting on a rock with her legs folded. What about you two? What is your opinion on all this? Personally, I still haven't taken the time to properly think about what we're going through. Alan glanced back with one eye and shrugged. What is there to think about? Whether it's this thing in our heads, the midget monsters in the school, that big bird over there, or the fact that we can now crush stone bare-handed or run faster than a car, what kind of conclusion do you expect to reach? The only thing we can and should do is just continue living our life like we always did. Don't you think that your words are a bit too callous? Gant uttered while planting his shield in the ground. Some people have family and friends back on Earth. While we indeed are orphans, as Ziora stated, there are still things we care about. And don't get me started on the fact that there are thousands of people dying because of this. Half of our school is missing and I'm not optimistic enough to think that they were safely returned to Earth. Alan sighed and spread his arms with a shrug. I understand what you're saying, but those feelings are misplaced at best. What are you even debating? If this situation is a good thing or not? I'm pretty sure the answer to that is already pretty damn evident. Of course, it's a bad thing. Now the question is, are you willing to just take it like a man, or whine about the fact that you survived? Gant frowned but didn't reply. Flavia let out a breath. Stop that, Alan. You're being too insensitive. TCH, can't blame me. It's not really my thing to solace others. Lays closed his eyes for a moment then turned to Flavia. What about you, Miss Gina? As a teacher, I was curious to know what you thought about a bunch of students thrown into a game of death and life. Well, I don't know if this is appropriate to say, but I believe that I practically lost every relation to the job of teacher the moment we woke up here, she said and looked at the sky. Both my father and grandfather are military men. My grandpa even participated in the battles of the Cold War that made Aurora take over the world. I was taught since young about values that were slightly different from others. I guess. She scratched her cheek with a wry smile. What I'm trying to say is, you and I both know that this became a survival game the very second we heard a voice speak in our minds. So, please, don't give me too much credit as a teacher. Because instead of trying to help my students, I decided to go along with the two persons I trusted the most and whom I was sure would give me the best odds of survival. Following the fading sound of her last word, a comfortable silence installed itself and Lays sighed again. I see. I was often told to be mature for my age, but it seems I still have ways to go. Just take Ziora, for example. I'm sure that he didn't even flinch when he saw the kobolds. Flavia chuckled softly. You're plenty mature, Lays. Rachna is a special case, you could say. Alan snickered. True. You want to know my assumption on what Rach thinks about this mess? Lays blinked and Leia tilted her head in interest. Shoot, she uttered, and the rest of the gang shared her curiosity. Alan cackled. I have a question for you. What time was it when the school was taken away? Time. Lays scowled. You mean, around 2 p.m.? Yeah, exactly. Right after lunch break, Alan smirked. Flavia quickly realized what he was coming at and couldn't hold back her smile. Usually, Rak sleeps on the roof between 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. It's his personal ritual. You can be sure that he hates being interrupted. Wait, you're not saying, Blaze was baffled. Yep, from how I see it, Rak is probably going through this game so diligently because he's pissed to not be able to have his daily nap and wants to complain to whoever's responsible. You can't be serious, Gant muttered. I'm afraid he is, Flavia quipped. Rachna hates anything that breaks his internal peace, so speak. He also has a very weird sense or priorities. Imagine, what if you were walking on the street and saw a piano about to fall on a puppy? What would you think first? To save the puppy. Leia said. That would be the most normal thing to do. But Rachna isn't like that. He wouldn't even need to think to rush to save the puppy, but on the other hand, his head would filled with but only one concern. Where does this piano come from? Alan's laugh soon resounded over the silence caused by the wing walkers while Rachna suddenly sneezed for no reason. Chapter 21. Discussion planning. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Rachna rubbed his nose with an invisible frown as he stood on top of a tree. Am I supposed to say that someone is badmouthing me now? He muttered, and Pronos blinked in confusion from his spot in his scarf. I believe that is merely a superstition, Alexa interjected, and Rachna was mildly surprised. How interesting, he casually said while jumping to another tree, all while inspecting the school grounds to his right. He was currently circling the school from one side while Dan was checking the other. He landed on a branch in a feral way that probably himself wasn't aware he had used. Tell me, Alexa, what are you exactly? He decided to chat with his virtual guide as he analyzed the goblins and eagles swarming the school. As I have said previously, I am an artificial intelligence tasked to. Spare me that. She was quickly interrupted. All right. In that case, answer this. Are you an AI connected to a server or are you independent? I do not understand your query. Rachna sighed and swiftly hid behind the tree he was on when a goblin turned his way. He did it with a calm and completely carefree expression. Let me rephrase then. You stated that you were a personal AI, correct? Affirmative. Then, am I safe to assume that you only respond to me? Yes. Okay, so you should be able to tell me. Where does your source code reside? Inside my head or within an external server that people may be able to alter? This time, Alexa took some time to answer and Rachna patiently waited, still hopping from one tree to another. I think I understand what you wish to know, Rachna. Oh. Tell me. You are worried that the system might have a way to monitor, spy, or harm you through me. You're half correct. Half. Answer my question first. I am, as you put it, independent. Where I reside is, technically speaking, within your brain. I am connected to a server indeed. However, it's a one-way road where I only receive information but not the opposite. For instance, appraisal functions in a peer-to-peer setting where a request is sent to the server in order to verify the validity of the scan and see if the target of said appraisal is susceptible to it. If not, nothing is sent. If yes, the target will give you a result and not the server itself. Therefore, you do not need to worry about secrecy. The system forbids such things so that no host can take advantage of it, unfairly, at least. I see, Rachna blandly responded and spotted Dan a few dozens of meters away from him. He made a hand sign in his direction and the spectacled teen scowled. Rally point. He thought. He even knows our hand signs. He was suspicious of Rachna's identity but he felt that it wasn't important in this situation. He turned around and made a circle with his index and thumb and flashed it over his shoulder, the regular military hand sign for, I understand. Rachna watched him go back from the way he came and he did the same shortly afterward. On the way back, Alexa spoke again. Rachna, may I inquire why I was only half correct? If he could smile, Rachna probably would have done it at her words. What Alexa didn't know was that this question of hers had consolidated his thoughts. The answer to that, Alexa, lies in what you just asked me. Also, feel free to speak whenever you want in the future, he added. If you ever believe that I'm doing something wrong, or if you ever think that there's a better way, or even if you just want to join in the conversation for fun, do it. Even for a high-class AI like her, that was too much to interpret, and she fell silent out of pure confusion. A minute later, just about when Rachna and Dan were going to reassemble with the others, she instead chose to retort about something her host had said. I do not join conversations for fun. The corner of Rachna's lips raised a little. If anyone he knew was there at that moment, no existing word would have been able to describe their shock. We'll see, Alexa. We'll see, *****. 20 minutes after they had left for their scouting, Rachna and Dan landed back where the rest of the group was. You're back, Lays stood up. How did it go? The two scouts looked at each other and nodded as if they had an agreement. Dan stepped forward and started reporting what he had seen. To be honest, there wasn't a lot that was noteworthy. At least from the outside. First of all, the eagles seem to be sleeping. They are scattered all over the roofs of the different buildings. As for the goblins, most of them seem to be resting, but there are few groups that go out into the forest from time to time. I'd guess, to hunt or patrol. But that's not really important. The crucial part is that I spotted at least 5 hobgoblins like the one we fought earlier, Dan added, and Leia grimaced. She wasn't the only one uncomfortable with the notion of fighting against 5 of those monsters. What about you, Ziora? Anything to add? Rachna closed his eyes from his seat next to Flavia and mused. Your findings are basically the same as mine, he said. Though, that's only for the outside. What? Dan was puzzled. From what I smelled, there aren't a lot of goblins inside the buildings, but there are at least 2 more hobgoblins as well as an even stronger monster, Rachna declared without missing a beat. Smelled, you say? Lays made a weird expression. Rachna nodded unperturbed. He pointed at his nose. I can smell living things, and the intensity of the smell is indicative of their strength. This ability is also a byproduct of my Nirvana skill. This skill of yours is confusing me more and more, Alan uttered. You extend your nails, control wolves, smell people. Are you turning into a werewolf or something? He jested, but the lack of reaction from Rachna made him sweat. In any case, Rachna continued. We have to plan this out. To start off, we need to decide if we just want to collect the souls we need or clear the entire area. Isn't that obvious? Gant said. We just want to reach the quota. No need to take more risks. Wait, Gant, he raises a good point. Lays raised his voice and his gang looked at him. It certainly has its risks, but if we clear the area, we can both increase our level and gather a large number of souls. Regarding our level, I'm sure it will be a huge help to fight Aquila. As for the souls, remember that the mission prompt said we would receive a proportionate amount of tallies, as well as a title if one possesses the most souls. It has quite a lot of advantages. Gant furrowed his eyebrows and looked down pensively. It's true that if you put it like that, it might be worth the risk. So, what's your choice? Rachna asked again, and Lays resolved himself. Okay, I'm in. Let's clear them out. Good, then let's talk about the attack, Rachna stated, then started drawing something on the ground with a twig. In just a few seconds, he had drawn a very rough map of the school and their group's relative position to it. He circled one of the buildings and opened his mouth. The strong presence I smelled is in here. I would bet that it's the goblin's leader. It's a reasonable guess, Dan commented. But what do you want to do about it? I'll go kill it. Wah, I'll go there alone and kill the leader. I'll try to do it as fast as possible and attract the attention to me so that you can raid them while they're distracted and in disarray. However, their number is nothing to scoff at. No matter how skilled all of you are, it will be hard to kill them all without casualties. I assume you have a proposal for that? Lays questioned. Rachna nodded calmly. After, or while I'm fighting the leader, if it happens to be stronger than what I expected, you will rush in and concentrate your efforts into getting to the gymnasium before they swarm you. Once you occupy it, you will have the best terrain to retaliate. The gym only has 2 entrances and it's easy for you to defend them. It's also our best counter to the eagles. The roof of the gym is half composed of glass panels. Open them, and you can safely shoot them from there. Everyone was speechless. It did sound like it was the most effective strategy they had. Occupying the gym would render useless both the enemy's numerical advantage as well as the eagle's overwhelming airborne threat. But this plan has a big flaw, Dan remarked. Which is you. What if you can't get their attention? Or what if the leader kills you? If that happens, there's no way we can occupy the gym. Don't worry about that, Rachna calmly responded and stood up. I'm confident enough that I can flee if I have to. Additionally, let's say that I have an army of my own. Though, the choice to follow this plan through is yours, Lays Walker. Lays closed his eyes and pondered. All right. We'll do as you said. But I will only go in when I'm sure that you have caught their attention. Otherwise, I'm sorry to say that I won't do anything. We don't have anything to lose here. You're taking the most risk, so I can't complain. Rachna nodded and turned toward Flavia and Alan. I can guess your answer, but what about you two? Obviously, I'm in, Alan shrugged. I as well, Flavia followed. But I think that at least the 2 of us should go with you. Rachna shook his head. No need. As I said, if I ever need to run, I can. But if I bring more people with me, it's another story. I would have to cover you and things would get a lot harder. Flavia bit her lip and ultimately sighed with a lowered head. Fine. But you better return to us alive. No worry. I don't intend to die any soon, he stated and looked at everyone. You all will enter from the front while I will infiltrate from the back. The timing for your entrance will probably be obvious enough, but I believe it'll be time in about 20 minutes. Clear. Lays snorted and he and his gang replied with one word, Roger. Chapter 22. First times you are listening at novelfull.audio. Rachna zoomed through the forest, shaking leaves and bushes as he passed by. His speed was so high that only a shadow could be seen. He currently was enjoying the feeling of the wind on his fur and the uncanny but pleasant control he had over his 9 tails. It was without saying that he had chosen to transform into a wolf to get to his location faster. With a 70% increase in his speed, he quickly reached the perfect vantage point behind one of the school buildings. To put things into perspective, he was to the west of the grounds while Lay's group was to the east, where the gate was. When Rachna landed on a tree to look at his target, one could now see that Sonata was still on him even in this form, and Pronos was latched around his neck to not be ejected when he sprinted. The guard is higher than I expected, he commented inwardly as he spotted the goblins walking on the periphery of the school grounds. It was necessary to precise that the building in front of Rachna at the moment wasn't facing him. In other words, there weren't any doors leading to the west. So, it was only natural to think that there would be fewer monsters here. Pronos, the usual, he spoke with the distorted gruff voice he had in this form. Pronos hissed to show he understood and jumped down before blending in with his surroundings. Then, Rachna squinted and laid prone on the tree branch, waiting for the right moment. At the same time, a prompt came from the system. Through executing a specific action and meeting several conditions, you have learned a new skill, Stealth. Stealth, LV.1. A rudimentary skill for those seeking to become dwellers of the shadows. Once entering stealth state, while immobile, the host will become 50% less perceptible to other living creatures. The effect will be halved when moving. Note: The true effectiveness of this skill depends severely on the environment, and the effects may vary depending on the difference between the senses value of the user and the one looking. Cost: 1 MP per min. Would you look at that, Rachna jested internally and immediately activated this skill. He then felt as if his entire body was placed underwater. It felt oddly comfortable. While in this state, he watched as the first goblin fell on the ground due to Prono's poison. One thing Rachna had been wondering about was why the iron poison worked almost instantly for most creatures, although they evidently had mana like the nine-tailed wolf he fought. It probably has more to do with how much mana one has than just merely possessing some, he concluded. I wonder if, Rachna mumbled as he looked at Pronos slithering toward its next target. He first opened his contracted pet status and used appraisal on the iron poison trait. Iron poison. This poison is also known as the blue molten worm. When it infiltrates the body system, the rate and scale of the propagation entirely depend on the quantity injected and the initial strength of the poison formula. The more iron energy is put into it, the deadlier it is. It has no antidote, it can only be suppressed or extracted. However, it only stays in the body for 3 hours before disappearing without a trace. Note: for the poison to work, the victim's remaining mana has to be lower than the user's maximum mana. However, the rate of propagation, as well as the damage done by the poison, will depend on the difference between the victim's defense value and the actual quantity of mana infused in the poison by the user, as well as the specific amount of mana left in the victim. Cost: variable. The more mana is channeled into the poison, the more potent it is. You have discovered you're able to analyze system components. Appraisal has leveled up. Rachna snorted. He should have tried this sooner. This gave him a considerably clearer view of the possible applications of this poison in a fight, and as a bonus, appraisal had leveled up. Based on this information, he could tell for instance that Pronos must have had used around 30 MP on the nine-tailed wolf. The wolf had 26 of defense and its Nirvana skill had siphoned the entirety of its mana. These two facts, coupled with the quantity of mana used by Pronos, were probably the reason why the poison acted so fast on its entire left side. It had been paralyzed in literally a second after it had been forced to use the rest of its mana. As Rachna was thinking that, he heard one goblin make a confused noise. After 3 of them had fallen to Pronos, it was finally time for one of them to notice. Now. Rachna jumped down the tree branch and accelerated in record time. His sudden appearance was noticed by the many goblins in the area, but before they could even croak, Rachna opened his eyes wide and activated his intimidation skill. All of the goblins that were looking at him suddenly froze in fear, and before they could process what was happening, he sprung on the closest goblin. He made it fall on the ground before ripping his throat apart with his fangs. LV.5 Lesser Goblin killed. Requirement for level up updated. Current progress. 22/80ths. Rachna didn't waste any more time and immediately targeted another goblin, and Pronos similarly discarded any intention to camouflage himself and rushed from one goblin to another. With the 2 of them, in less than 10 seconds, 10 goblins had fallen. After that small time period, the goblins finally ran away once the daze they had been put into by the intimidation was over. It's time, Rachna uttered and lowered his head for a second before howling to the sky. His call got an immediate result as several howls responded to it. ***** From their hiding point, Lay's group heard these calls and immediately made the connection. So, that's what he meant by army, Flavia whispered, seemingly to no one, but everyone agreed with her. I had no idea there were so many wolves in this forest, Lays commented. They probably were meant to be a secondary threat after goblins. It's quite lucky that we had someone with the ability to command them, he said, and his group nodded. Meanwhile, Rachna calmly sat as a massive group of grey wolves gathered behind him. After only a few minutes, their number had already reached the 50s. It was then that Rachna growled out one word: attack. The entire pack of wolves rushed past him the second he gave out his order. They spread out into two groups and circled the building in front of them. Not even a second later, goblins' shouts and cries of pain could be heard. Now that the diversion had been taken care of, Rachna looked up and saw a shadow behind one of the windows of the last floor. He stood up and waved his 9 tails before kicking the ground. He jumped toward the closest window and used the ledge to propel himself to another one higher. He repeated the same move twice before using his claws to break the lock of a window on the last floor. He leaped inside and silently landed on the ground. He scanned the room before sniffing the air. He growled a little bit, more out of instinct than anything, and slowly returned to his human form. Or rather, the Aryan form would be more accurate. He used his spatial ring to re-wear his clothes and promptly transformed Sonata. When he was done, as if on cue, Pronos came in through the opened window and climbed his shoulder again. However, Rachna remained still even after a minute. As Pronos was gradually growing confused at his master in Title's actions, the latter finally moved and it was right on time when a crack appeared on the wall to his left before being destroyed by a very large fist which he dodged by leaning backward. Rachna glanced at his assailant through the cracks and a pair of yellow eyes stared back. He gripped Sonata and tried to sever the arm in front of him with a rapid swing, but the opponent quickly pulled back and made the rest of the wall to collapse. Rachna then stood face to face with the monster who was supposedly leading the army of goblins outside. This creature was bigger than even the hobgoblins. It was as tall as the ceiling was high and vastly larger than its brethren. It wore leather and metal armor and held a large scimitar in its right hand. Wordlessly, Rachna used appraisal and a transparent system window appeared in front of him. Name. None age. 2 level. 13 race. Orc attributes. Strength. 13 endurance. 12 speed. 4 dexterity. 5 intelligence. 2 luck. 1 weapon. Steel 2-handed saber. Plus 30 attack armor. Plated leather armor. Plus 30 defense sub-attributes. Stamina. 46 MP 20 swiftness. 12 agility. 14 senses. 23 ATR cap 37 attack. 97, 67 plus 30, defense. 79, 49 plus 30, magic attack. 6 MP Regen. 0.04 per minute proficiencies. Greatsword, Mastery, LV.3, Magic Skills. None Cognitive Skills, Passive. Leadership, LV.1, Spontaneous Skills, Active. None Unique or Racial Traits. Minor Regeneration. Wounds heal a bit faster. A far cry from true regeneration. Note. The chieftain of a nameless tribe of goblins. Slow but strong. Mediocre dexterity but very tough. Decent sword proficiency. Rachna singled out the most important points in an instant and made a decision. Pronos, this one has too much defense for your poison. Go deal with the 2 hobgoblins downstairs. You should be able to. The little snake looked at him a bit unsurely at first before slowly nodding and slithering out of the room. The orc looked at him leave without doing anything. In fact, this monster seemed very relaxed in contrast to the goblins and the hobgoblins. How nice of you to let him go, Rachna uttered without truly meaning anything, but the orc turned back toward him and flashed a grin. A duel is an orc style, it spoke with a low-toned voice and Rachna's eyes widened slightly. Interesting, you're the first monster that I hear speak human speech. And you are my first battle, it said and gripped its sword with both hands. Entertain me, beast man. Rachna whirled Sonata with an unreadable expression and took a stance with the blade of his weapon pointing forward. Gladly, orc. Chapter 23. Rage. You are listening at novelfull.audio. A steel saber clashed against an azure blade. Ragnar winced slightly at the power behind the strike and deflected the orc's weapon instead of going against it. He then tried to kick the hands of his opponent to make it lose its weapon, but it was parried remarkably well for a creature with that look. Ragnar tried to pull back, but it wasn't in time as the orc punched forward with its free hand. He grunted and bent his body with inhuman agility to dodge. The fist grazed his nose, and after almost making a 90-degree angle with his body, Ragnar let himself fall and caught himself by slamming a hand on the floor. While he was still in that position, the orc swung its saber and he put all of his strength in his arm to propel himself up and avoid it. When he landed, the two fighters looked at each other again. This small bout was short-lived, but the two of them were now aware of the other's strength. After a few seconds, Ragnar's eyes narrowed and he kicked the ground while giving a mental command to Alexa. 2 to dexterity, 1 to speed. The change in his body happened instantly, and profiting from that, he used it to increase his speed mid-sprint. He reached the orc in a burst of speed that the latter didn't expect. The monster's eyes narrowed and quickly decided to counter with a punch rather than its sword. It was too late to raise its saber since Ragnar was in its close space. Azure Sonata was thrust toward the orc's chest, and Ragnar expected it to do a lot of different things to dodge or block it, and it chose the one he wished the least for. The chieftain stepped forward and let Sonata pierce its body, carefully making sure that it would not hit any vitals. It then followed with a punch that Ragnar was forced to dodge by letting go of his spear and fall backward. But unfortunately for him, the orc wasn't done, and then followed by hacking with its saber at full force. Ragnar extended his claws and used them to stick to the ground. He used this to launch himself to the side just before the two-handed sword struck the ground and caused the first environmental damage caused by this fight. The floor cracked and quite rapidly broke apart across the entire room, but the good foundations of the building made it so that it wouldn't collapse. However, that also meant Ragnar lost his footing for a second, and that was enough for the orc to deal out an unavoidable kick. Ragnar managed to reduce the shock by pushing himself away from the creature's leg, but he was still sent crashing on the wall. The concrete wall fissured and the shape of his body was carved into it. He groaned and stood back on his feet as he watched the orc pull out Sonata from its chest. At the same time, Alexa spoke into his mind, "You have been diagnosticated lightly injured. Ireful Shell has been activated, Ragnar." Ragnar briefly opened his status window to see his defense go up by quite literally 0.65. He didn't know if he should be amused or upset. Defense isn't for the current me anyway, he thought, then furrowed his eyebrows. He was starting to feel and hear something on the back of his mind. After a few seconds, it became very clear. He gradually felt like wanting to rip apart the orc in front of him as a voice, or rather, a whisper talked to him. If it had been anyone else, they would have probably already lost half of their mental sanity. But to Ragnar, this felt like an annoying bug at best. He closed his eyes and tuned it out just by focusing a little bit. He then stood straight and stared at the orc, who was inspecting Sonata with a curious eye. Ragnar didn't seem bothered the least that his weapon was in another's hands. "I would drop that weapon if I was you," he said. But it didn't sound like a threat. It was more of a warning. The orc looked back. "That is for me to decide, beast man." "I see," Ragnar replied impassively. "Then, have fun." Before the green-skinned monster could understand his words, Sonata began to glow and fume because of what appeared to be a rapid release of heat. The orc abruptly felt a burning pain and grimaced. A weak current of electricity was generated by the spear and its hand contracted against its will. "What is this?" It roared out, and Sonata released one final burst of ion energy. It almost was as if a small bomb had detonated, and Ragnar was forced to cover his eyes for a second. When the flash of light was over, he saw Sonata resting on the floor as a scarf while the orc's arm had been fried and hanged limp at its side. "That's why I told you to let go. The old man made Sonata so that it would only answer to my fingerprints or DNA, Ragnar indifferently explained, and the orc glared at him. It couldn't use its right arm anymore, but, without his weapon, its opponent wouldn't be able to get the upper hand. At least, that's what it believed. Ragna took an unarmed stance, and for the first time since he was summoned by the system, he truly stirred his reserves of mana. Round 2, Big Guy. Call of Fangs. ******. A few moments earlier, the wolves had already started to advance into the goblins' forces. They were definitely strong compared to them, but the sheer numerical difference didn't allow for a lot of damage to be done. In the end, the wolves ended up becoming a very solid distraction, just like Ragna expected it to. Dan looked at the gate of the school with a careful eye. It should be fine now. Ziora has managed to attract at least 80% of them. Lays nodded and turned toward everyone. It's now or never. Don't loiter and run to the gym as fast as you can. The formation is as we decided earlier. Understood. Flavia and Alan stood amidst the gang with a smile. It was quite odd to be surrounded by a very obviously trained squad, but it was quite a refreshing new experience. Good, let's go. Gant, you lead the way. When Lays finished giving his orders, Gant began to rush toward the gate with his shield in front of him. The rest of the gang quickly followed, and Alan and Flavia were the last to go, meant to act as the rear guard. The second they entered the school grounds, a group constituted of the few remaining goblins noticed them, rapidly followed by the many eagles on the rooftops. For some reason, the avian predators didn't seem to be interested in the wolves in the slightest. But at the sight of a group of humans, they instantly flew off in their direction. Dan clicked his tongue as he ran at the very front of their formation. The eagles' attention is way more focused than we expected. They will not attack directly, but it's a matter of time. Be ready to intercept them. He shouted to the group, but more specifically, Flavia. When they were going through their strategy earlier, she had told them of her ability. Among them, she probably was their best way of dealing with the eagles after their guns. After hearing Dan's warning, she glanced at the large birds gradually gathering together in the sky. Although it would tire her very fast, she could probably twist their neck fast enough so that they wouldn't have the chance to attack. However, that would be a very short-lived resort. After Dan shouted, he immediately accelerated and left the others behind. He was the fastest, and he was sure going to make use of that advantage. He dashed past a small group of goblins and slashed the necks of 3 of them with a flick of his blade without slowing down in the slightest. His job was to reduce the number of enemies on the path to the gym, as well as making sure they could smoothly enter said building. As for the goblins that he dodged and could not kill, Gant would be their next opponent, who would then in turn give the ones he couldn't take to Lays and Leia. After that, the rest of the group would finish off any leftovers, while the people at the back of the formation were to defend from both long range and close-range sneak attacks. Exactly like how Alan caught an arrow with his gloved hand and Flavia made one return to its sender. After 2 very smooth sailing minutes, they had gotten pretty close to their objective, and a path littered with dead goblins laid behind them. But that was immediately broken when Dan arrived at the door of the gym. His eyes widened behind his glasses, and he very quickly jumped back to dodge a spiked mace. He then watched as a hobgoblin came out of the gym through the broken door and cursed. Shit. This fucker must have taken this place for himself, he muttered and used scan. The grade of his skill was vastly different compared to Ragna's, but he still got the crucial information. This hobgoblin was at the same level as the other, but he had 1 or 2 additional attributes as well as better equipment. Dan grunted and retreated while keeping an eye on the monster. Unfortunately, the hobgoblin didn't seem to be keen on chasing him. Bastard, he wants to stay there. Do these things have territorial tendencies? When he returned to the main group, he didn't need to say anything, as none of them were blind enough to see the hobgoblin since they weren't that far. This was merely a schoolyard, after all, a high school on top of that. At best, the distance from the gate to the gym was around 500 meters. If it wasn't for the fact that they couldn't recklessly run into hostile territory, especially as a group, they would have reached their destination a lot faster. It was also a shame that their destination wasn't closer to the borders of the school grounds. They could have taken the same approach as Rachna had if it was the case. Then, when they thought that things couldn't get any worse, the first eagle plunged in their direction. It was anticlimactically killed by Flavia with a flick of her wrist, but the second soon came down, and the third, and the fourth. No choice, Lays groaned. Everyone, start using your firearms. Do not mind the ammunition and just shoot. Half of you, focus on the eagles, the rest come forward and shoot the hobgoblin as we approach. Miss Gina, we're counting on you, he added and accelerated with the rest of the group, and the sounds of gunshots echoed across the area. Meanwhile, when Rachna uttered the name of his skill, four puddles of darkness formed behind him and started bulging as the same number of figures emerged. 4 wolves, with midnight black fur that could probably become unseeable in the shadows and a pair of glowing red eyes. They all growled unanimously as they appeared and slowly stood on Rachna's side, baring their fangs at the orc. The chieftain grimaced at the sight but calmly raised its saber with its remaining hand. At the same time, gunshots pierced the walls and reached their ears. Rachna's wolf ears twitched, but he ignored it and focused on the status windows of his summoned wolves instead. Chapter 24. Darkness Reigns. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Name. None. Age. 0 level. 8 race. Shadow Wolf. Attributes. Strength. 2 endurance. 1.5 speed. 5 dexterity. 5 intelligence. 2 luck. 1 sub-attributes. Stamina. 15 MP 20 swiftness. 14 agility. 15 senses. 13.5 ATR cap 16.5 attack. 18.75 defense. 6.5 magic attack. 6 MP regen. 0.02 per minute proficiencies. Bite, LV max. Plus 100% attack when biting. Magic skills. None. Cognitive skills, passive. Body of shadow. The holder's body is made of shadows. Increased damage from any light element attack, immune to dark element attacks, and highly resistant to physical attacks. Spontaneous skills, active. Shadow meld, LV.1. The user is able to jump into shadows and emerge from them at will. They cannot attack from shadows, but it's not a problem to spy or fast travel with them. Cooldown. 2 minutes max duration. 5 minutes. Unique or racial traits. Dark sense. The smell of shadow wolves isn't anything like a normal living being. They perceive the smell of darkness and are able to pinpoint anything releasing negative emotions. Interesting. I'll have to look at how their attributes are calculated later, he thought, then took out the simple knife he bought from the shop. He unsheathed it and gripped it in reverse. As for the wolves behind him, he gave them only one order: go wild. The 4 shadow beasts instantly disappeared at his command, draped by a veil of darkness. The orc blinked and panicked, and it couldn't see them anymore. But before it could do anything about it, Rachna charged at him. No matter what, the orc was unable to ignore him because of his speed and could only bring up his saber to swat him away. But mid-swing, the 4 shadow wolves surfaced from its own shadow and bit its wrist, ankles, and shoulder. The monster roared but still managed to swing its weapon, albeit slower. The shadow wolves had a decent attack, but they weren't strong enough to injure the orc. Rachna calmly watched the blade coming at him and used his knife to deflect it. The small weapon immediately cracked and shattered, but the saber was successfully veered out of its course. Then, Rachna grabbed the orc's throat in an incredible display of swiftness. Not a word or a look was exchanged before his claws extended and managed to cut the creature's carotids, but not much deeper. When the orc started gargling with its very own blood, Rachna quickly used his other hand and pointed 2 fingers at its eyes. The orc paled and tried to raise his hand after dropping his weapon, but the shadow wolf on his shoulder made him freeze and wince in pain just before he saw two claws extend and pierce his eyes. They reached the brain and finished the chieftain off in a second. The skill clause has increased to level 3. LV.13 Orc killed. You have killed a foe 5 levels above yours. Requirement for level up updated. Current progress. 56/80ths. Ragnar let go of the monster's throat, which was making his hand dreadfully bloodied, and jumped back. He watched as his foe collapsed on the ground, lifeless. He flicked his hand to shake off the blood and sighed. So, defense truly is lower in places like the throat and the eyeballs, affirmative. The value shown on the status is essentially a generalization. Alexa confirmed his words and he sat on the floor to rest a little. He took a deep breath and then one of the shadow wolves came to his side and started rubbing against his cheek. Hey, Ragnar muttered and started stroking the wolf. He looked at the other 3 and fell into his thoughts. You should have at least 3 minutes left. Do you hear the gunshots outside? Go help the people there to reach the large building to the north, he ordered, and the 4 beasts sank into shadows right away. Ragnar rested for a little more afterward and stood up. He picked his scarf up and wore it before transforming into a wolf. He ran out of the room and went to the bottom floor of the building where Pronos should be fighting the 2 hobgoblins he had smelled. When he landed on the tiles of the floor after leaping over the stairs, he was met with one dead hobgoblin in the corridor. It had several distinct bite marks on its body along with the blue veins around them. Ragnar sniffed, then jumped over the corpse to head to a certain classroom. When he reached it, the wall had been smashed in, and behind it, he saw Pronos strangling the hobgoblin while biting its neck. The large monster tried to pry him off, but after just a few seconds, because of both a lack of air as well as the iron poison reaching its brain, it ultimately died. Pronos stopped clinging to its neck and slumped on the splintered floor with his tongue sticking out, completely exhausted. Ragnar praised him internally for having killed them. At least, he was confident that the little snake wouldn't die considering his very high defense, but killing the hobgoblins was, for a fact, hard for Pronos since his means of attack other than his poison were limited. He walked to the little snake and hovered his head above him. Feeling tired? He asked with his warped voice, and Pronos almost had a heart attack before calming down at the familiar purple eyes gazing at him. The little snake hissed and waved his tail dismissively as if saying that it was a piece of cake. His master grunted and lowered his head in his direction. Pronos tilted his head before understanding his human friend's intention. He slowly but surely slithered on top of his head before snuggling under Sonata and falling asleep. Immediately after, Ragnar rushed out of the building, thinking that it was enough dilly-dallying. Back to the moment where Lays permitted the use of firearms. The Eagles began their assault for good, and Flavia was put under quite a lot of pressure. Sure, she had a bit of help, but you didn't need a lot of imagination to know that it was hard to hit a bird flying at full speed with a gun. So, most of it came down to her, and it was very taxing on her mind. Every second or so, her eyes and focus would go back and forth between every single bird in her vision, twisting their neck within the split of a second. The toll on her mind had already made her fatigue resistance level up twice. If it wasn't for Alan carrying her on his back, she would have probably been unable to even walk. Meanwhile, at the front of the formation, those still running toward the gym, were trying to find a way to fight the hobgoblin that stood in their way. Dan, are you sure this one is stronger than the last we fought? Lays inquired as he sliced a goblin's neck that had leaped in his direction. Yes, 100%. Lays' expression darkened. Dealing with the hobgoblin in itself wasn't a problem, but dealing with it while avoiding casualties was another story. They couldn't just stop to fight it, or they would be overwhelmed by the goblins and the eagles. As for the second entrance of the gym, it was on the west side of the building, too risky to get to. Lays looked over his shoulder to see Flavia still taking out the eagles, but you had to be blind to not see that she would soon her limit. As he was thinking, they had already reached the critical range before the hobgoblin started to attack. He stopped the group around 40 meters away from the hobgoblin that was using the broken door of the building to shield himself from the bullets. "Sorry, Miss Gina. Please hold out a little longer," he whispered and raised his hand. "Concentrate fire on the hobgoblin. Temporarily ignore the eagles and throw whatever explosives you have left at this bastard." Within a single breath after his command, everyone had already changed their target while some who had still some explosives left had already pulled out their pin. The hobgoblin exclaimed in shock when it saw the several objects being thrown at it and made an action purely based on its instinct and stepped back a few times before crouching behind the door it was holding. The grenades exploded and black smoke shrouded the area for a few seconds. When it was dispersed, the green skinned monster stood up angrily with nothing more than a small piece of metal in its hand, the remains of the door it was holding. A few shrapnel had managed to pierce its skin, but other than that, it hadn't received much damage. The hobgoblin grabbed its spiked club and charged at the group with bloodshot eyes, with a hand covering its eyes from the bullets flying its way. Its skin was incredibly thick and the bullets could only bruise it, sometimes drawing just a bit of blood. Gant winced as he watched the scene. He prepared himself to engage the monster when he heard a voice from behind him, "You big guy. Shield up." He blinked in confusion, but he nonetheless crouched while putting his shield over his head. He then felt something land on it. "Thanks," Alan said and grinned. He lowered his body to jump and Gant was smart enough to get the clue and help him gain momentum as he jumped. The blonde teen soared through the air for a moment before falling toward the hobgoblin with a fist reared up. His gloves glowed a little bit, and when his fist hit the monster's head, a shockwave was released and the large monster face planted on the ground. Alan himself was hurt by the recoil of his blow and rolled on the ground, gaining a few scratches in the process. He groaned when he finally could control his own body and hissed in pain as he held his arm. Lay's first thought that this was as good as done when he saw the clear path in front of him, but that changed very quickly when he spotted 3 other hobgoblins running toward them from their left, and as if things couldn't get any worse, he also saw from the corner of his eyes Flavia holding her head in pain. "You've got to be kidding me." The eagles promptly swarmed them and a few members of the gang were injured by their claws. They started shooting at them, but one after another, the guns stopped firing and instead made a clicking sound, running out of ammunition. Then, because of the threat from above, the goblins also began to make some damage. "Damn it!" Lays shouted. "Forget about fighting back. Run to the gym." Alan heard him and watched as some threw their weapon away and dashed toward the gym at full speed only to be hit in the back. He groaned as he stood, still holding his arm. He looked to the side to see Flavia desperately trying to reactivate. But her mind was so muddled that she couldn't see an eagle directly aiming for her head. His eyes widened. "Flavia." That's when it happened. "Be lost in darkness. Let it grip your heart," a disembodied voice echoed. Alan felt a chill go down his spine, and the next thing he knew, countless black objects fell from the sky and stabbed every eagle and goblin around. Alan blinked in shock and gaped at the blood raining along with the bodies it originated from. The wing walkers also froze in shock, and Lays looked at a certain silhouette that had appeared out of nowhere. Black long hair, crimson eyes, and a lithe figure wrapped in darkness. "What are you waiting for?" she hollered with a voice containing both grace and power. "Pick up your fallen comrades and shelter yourselves." Her hands formed 2 short lances of darkness and she whirled them, decapitating 2 eagles in the process. She exhaled and spoke, "Do not let this miserable place be your grave." Chapter 25. Rolling around. You are listening at novelfull.audio. At the appearance of the unknown woman, everyone stepped out of their daze and quickly carried the injured toward the gym. At the same time, said woman watched grimly at the hobgoblins approaching. She glanced at the eagles and goblins around her that she was killing with her shadows and clicked her tongue. "If I attack them now, I won't be able to keep these at bay," she thought, and as she was wondering if she should do it close and personal, she saw 4 black wolves jump out from the hobgoblin's shadows. She watched them bite the monsters' necks with widened eyes. She was surprised, but more than anything, she was relieved that the hobgoblins could be slowed down. That left enough time for the teens behind her to enter the building and, as expected, it took barely a minute for all of them to get inside. "You're the last one," she heard a female voice and looked over her shoulder to see the woman who had been killing the eagles until her arrival. She still looked tired, but she seemed to have recovered a bit. The unknown woman nodded at Flavia and the both of them retreated inside the gym where Alan was already being treated after his little stunt. Overall, he was fine, but his arm had taken a huge toll. "What's your name?" the woman asked Flavia as they both stood at the broken entrance, watching the goblins trying to get in. Thankfully, the eagles weren't trying to fly in. "Flavia. Flavia Gina." "Then, Flavia, you use telekinesis, right?" Yes. The woman mused. "Do you think you can block this hole with whatever furniture there is in this building? Even I can't indefinitely stop them from coming. My mana is running low and I do believe your group needs a bit of rest before re-engaging." Flavia pondered as she opened her status. She blinked in surprise when she saw what was written on it. She had become level 9 in the midst of things, her fatigue resistance was now level 9, and her nirvana skill had also leveled up. Telekinesis, LV.2. One of the most common spiritual abilities awakened as a nirvana skill. It has the potential to even bend spatial laws. LV.2 perk. The user can now affect multiple targets simultaneously. Note that the strain increases in proportion to the number of targets. Current lift. Intelligence *5. Intelligence *6, kg. Mana consumption. None. This is a spiritual skill fueled by psychic energy, thus no mana is involved in the process. Beware, overuse is severely precarious. The range of manipulation is only limited by the host's imagination and control. BDNV. She breathed in and answered, "I should be able to. I'm still a bit tired, but I should be able to move a few things. Even more, if I allocate a few of my points." The woman nodded. "Then please do so. I can only last for so long, after all." "All right," Flavia said and turned around when she remembered something. "Sorry, I forgot to ask your name." The red-eyed beauty looked back. "Oh, right. You can call me Nyx." When Rachna came out of the building, he saw that his army was still fighting a decent number of enemies but not nearly close to what he wanted. He growled and ran past both the wolves and the monsters while barking one word: retreat. The grey wolves complied and howled to order their retreat out of the fight. They hadn't suffered a lot of casualties thanks to their higher levels and their swiftness, but they couldn't do that for an extended period of time. That's also why they were forced to use attrition, which was the main cause why some of the hobgoblins as well as a large number of goblins had stopped paying attention to them. Rachna ran to the gym at full speed, hoping that things hadn't gone too wrong. When he arrived, he saw a literal sea of blood and corpses. He frowned and inspected the area to see if there were any human bodies, but fortunately, there were not. He then looked at the entrance of the gym, which was blocked by what seemed to be sports gear, and not far from it, he spotted his shadow wolves fighting 2 hobgoblins, with one dead already. He huffed and ran toward them. They didn't seem to expect it, since he was easily able to cut the throat of one of them with his claws after jumping on its shoulder. The shadow wolves then quickly took action and simultaneously bit the other who, already injured, succumbed. 3 LV.10 hobgoblins killed. Level up. +1 free point requirement for level up updated. Current progress. 6 out of 90. Rachna landed on the ground again and grunted, "So, these wolves' kills also count as mine. Good to know." The shadow wolves surrounded him in excitement and he petted the 4 of them with one tail each. "They're attached to me like newborns." Well, I guess it's what they are, he said inwardly, then focused on the remaining goblins banging on the walls of the gym. A nice thing to know, and which he already had noticed, was that he was way less targeted in his wolf form. The goblins might get angry at him sometimes, but they tended to not acknowledge his presence unless provoked. As for the eagles, there wasn't even anything to say about it. They simply didn't even put him in their eyes. Anyway, he mumbled and looked around. "Follow me," he said to his shadow wolves, and ran off toward the second entrance of the gym. When he arrived a moment later, he saw that the door wasn't broken like the other one, but this one also seemed to be barricaded from the other side, considering that there was a hobgoblin who was trying to get inside but couldn't. Rachna got pretty irritated. He looked up at the glass panels of the gym's roof, but none of them were open yet. They hadn't started to retaliate yet. They were probably recuperating. As he was trying to think of a way to get inside without turning into a human and fight a massive number of foes, he caught a glimpse of his shadow wolves licking their paws. It was then that an idea struck him. "You four, can you use shadow meld on another person?" he asked, and they understood him as they tilted their head in thought before nodding. "Then help me get inside this building." They promptly nodded and led him to a shade cast by the gym. The ground under them began to turn into something similar to a swamp. They then turned toward Rachna, waiting for him, and he carefully put a leg on the warped shadows before he felt himself fall inside. Meanwhile, the members of the Wing Walkers were resting inside the gym. Fortunately for them, there were no monsters inside. It seemed like the hobgoblin from earlier had taken it as its home or something. Now, everyone was focused on sharing the very few healing potions they had. Most of their tallies had gone into weapons after all. The number of potions they had wasn't even higher than 5. "Well, this could have been worse, honestly," Alan said whilst leaning against the wall, still holding his broken arm. Flavia, who was sitting on a chair at his right, nodded wearily with a bottle of water in her hands. She looked at the woman who was standing next to her with her arms crossed and eyes closed. "Thank you again for your help, Nyx. You are probably the only reason why there was no casualty on our side. If you hadn't come, we wouldn't have been able to save the injured." Nyx opened one eye and shook her head. "No need to thank me. I'm not the kindest of people, but most people would have done the same thing if they had both the ability and opportunity." Flavia smiled and nodded without saying anything. "While we're on this topic," Nyx continued. "Wasn't there another person with you?" Alan overheard that and glanced at her. "Do you mean Rachna?" She tilted her head. "Well, is he the one whom the clown from earlier passively called inhuman?" "I guess, yeah." Alan shrugged. "Now that you say that, I wonder what that meant. Why did that guy talk to Rachna like that?" "He said something like, 'those of your kind,' right?" "That's correct," Nyx affirmed. "I believed him to be one of the strongest here. And if I'm not wrong, you two are acquainted with him. What happened to him?" "We can't say for sure," Flavia responded. "He was the one who came up with the idea to occupy the gym, and that plan relied on the fact that he would grab the attention of the goblins before killing their leader." Nyx scowled. "Alone?" "Yep, he went solo," Alan said. "Though he had his contracted pet with him, Pronos." "How did he know where the leader was?" Alan snorted and tapped his nose. "Smell. At least, that's what he said." "Smell. How would?" She was interrupted by a sudden discomfort. She felt the shadows nearby suffer a change. She turned toward one corner of the gym, and both Alan and Flavia imitated her since they were confused about her sudden behavior. Nyx squinted her eyes, and a minute later, 4 silhouettes jumped out from the shadows. She was back in a fighting stance the second she saw them. Alan also pushed himself away from the wall, and Flavia stood up. Lay's group also noticed the new presence and put up their guard, but when they saw what it was, they were both confused and somewhat relieved. Because, although these 4 wolves were quite ominous looking, they had helped them earlier and, on top of that, they only knew of one person who was somewhat connected to wolves. After a few seconds of cautious observation, a fifth wolf came out from the shadows, but this one didn't jump out like the others. No, instead it did a front flip and rolled on the ground until lying back with its legs facing the sky. Some tried not to laugh or cry out at the cuteness. However, most of them immediately got curious about one thing: the 9 tails sprawled on the ground. After honestly hesitating for a good half a minute, they were taken out of their stupor when the 4 red-eyed wolves suddenly disappeared, followed by something that startled them even more. The 5 minutes have passed, huh? It was a deep and unknown voice. But, 2 people oddly found some familiarity in its tone, and they also very slowly made the connection, especially as they finally saw the blue scarf wrapped around the beast's neck. Flavia covered her mouth to hide her shock, and in contrast, Alan gaped without thinking about how he looked in the slightest. The 9-tailed wolf grunted and stood back on its feet. It looked around the place and blinked. It sighed and sat down. Well, I'm happy it worked out. Sorry, I didn't attract enough attention. There were many things going through the heads of everyone. It took them at least a full 60 seconds to properly connect the dots. Nix merely put on a thoughtful expression, but the rest reacted very ingeniously. What the fuck? Chapter 26. Oh. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 26. Oh. No way. Rack, is that you? Alan raised his voice dumbfounded, and the wolf looked back at him with a blank look. Who else would it be? He said, and slowly initiated his shapeshift. For the onlookers, it was quite a special experience to see the process of the change from Lupin to human physiology. They also noticed that during the transformation, a flash of light covered Rachna's body, and when it was gone, he was already human again and fully clothed. Well, to be exact, he looked humanoid again. He still had a tail on his back and a pair of ears on his head. He grunted and put a hand on his neck before cracking it. This needs a little more work. Going back and forth makes my body numb, he commented as if it was the most normal thing ever. He then turned toward Lays and fished out something from his spatial ring before throwing it to him. Lays woke up from his daze and clumsily caught the object. When he looked at it, he saw that it was a healing potion. That's a tier 9 potion. It's probably better than what you have. I asked my AI, you can dilute it in water and share it. The effects will be lessened, but enough for less important injuries. You, thanks. It's not like we really need to know now, do we? He said with an awkward smile and started telling his subordinates to give all the water they had, which mainly came from the cafeteria of the school. They most likely had gathered some provisions before going out into the forest. A sensible idea, Rachna thought while walking toward his friends, ignoring the very obvious stares he was receiving from everyone. I should have done the same. However, I don't feel as much hunger as I should. Odd. Is it because of the heart I ate? While he was pondering the question, he was once again hugged when he got close to Flavia. He grunted. This time at least, it's not a crushing one but more a, dare I say so, normal hug. Though I doubt any hug from this woman could ever be considered normal, he commented internally and waited for Flavia to slowly step back. Rachna then looked at her, then Alan, and ultimately found himself staring at a stranger next to them. He didn't need to open his mouth for her to get the hint, but he still asked, and you are? Nix. That's my name, she replied very succinctly. I'm afraid I'm going to hear more than just that. You're not from our school. Not a student, not a teacher, not a staff, and you certainly don't look like a parent that was caught up because of a very unfortunately timed meeting. So, I'll reformulate, where do you come from? This time, silence reigned for a moment. It didn't look like Nix was willing to answer. Or, to be exact, considering the brief downcast expression Rachna saw on her face, she herself didn't know how to answer. You don't know. Rachna tilted his head and that caught Alan and Flavia's attention. Nick sighed exhaustingly. I do know what caused my presence here. Or rather, I'd say who. But I do not know exactly how I arrived here. I fought someone and I was defeated. When I was at his mercy, he chose to seal me for some reason. After that, it's a complete blank. The first thing I saw when I woke up was a school building in front of me, a forest behind me, a horde of kobolds around me, and a weird notification box in front of my eyes. You were sealed. Flavia slowly reiterated. Does that mean you come from a place where magic exists? Nick snorted. Indeed, I do. But when I came to myself, most of my powers had been completely drained or extracted from my body. The only thing I have left from my prime is my shadow control that this Nirvana skill gives me. Oh, fucking hell, another one, Alan grumbled and Nix looked at him weirdly. I see, Rachna mused for a bit and his ears folded unconsciously. Flavia suddenly felt the urge to stroke them but did her best to restrain herself. So, anyway, Rach. Does that and that mean that I was right earlier? Alan rapidly recovered from his temporary depression and pointed at his friend's new appendages. Itchem. You're referring to your werewolf guess. Yeah, that. Rachna shrugged. I'd say you're right. My race is for a fact marked as 9-tailed werewolf. I can't say that I'm human anymore. But why? Flavia inquired. What happened? During the initiation, I awakened my Nirvana skill, and let's say that one of its effects did this to me. I don't mind the change. Especially since I think it saved my life. How come we didn't see your tails and ears before though? Alan followed up. Item. Put an illusion over me. That gray guy must have seen through it. I didn't put it back before coming in here because I simply have no mana left. I could use a potion but it'd be a waste considering we have time to rest. Makes sense. Rachna grabbed one of the pliable chairs placed against the wall and sat down on it. So. What happened on your way here? As I said, I didn't attract as much attention as I wanted and there are a lot more injured than I expected. Alan directly sat on the ground with a sigh. At first, it was a piece of cake. Your wolves, I think, aggroed most of them and that's when we started going in. But the closer we got, the more goblins started coming, and eventually, the eagles went full onslaught on us. As planned, Teach began to keep them away but we were cut off by a hobgoblin. I did manage to get rid of it pretty fast but Flavia couldn't go on any more and 3 more hobgoblins were coming in our direction. Those, Rachna exclaimed insouciantly. They were entangled with my shadow wolves. They're all dead if you're interested. Alan snorted in amusement. Of course, they are. Anyway, we were pretty much done for. Or, well, you could say that we were almost forced to abandon a lot of people behind. But then, shadows started impaling every monster around and she appeared, he pointed at Nyx. She practically saved our asses. Then, your wolves stalled the hobgoblins for us and we managed to get inside in the end. Rachna cringed a bit internally. It was a bit too close for comfort in his opinion. It was a plan he had proposed and if it wasn't for a powerful third party, it would have in essence failed miserably. He looked at Nyx, who was still standing still without moving, and she looked back. Thank you for helping them. It wouldn't have been pretty without your involvement. What goes around comes around, she replied offhandedly. I do hope you will be able to return the favor one day. Flavia and Alan laughed lightly as they watched 2 similarly aloof people exchange gratitude and pleasantries. Not long after that, Lays approached their group with Leia, Gant, and Dan in tow. The rest of the gang still resting and treating each other. Everyone sat in a circle and Nyx's expression twitched as she was finally forced to take a seat if she did not want to stand out like a sore thumb. Thanks for the potion, Ziora. The more serious cases are entirely out of danger now, it was the first thing Lays said. No problem, Rachna responded. So, what do we do now? Leia spoke up and they looked at her. What, I'm just asking. Are we going to get started on killing the damn birds or not? Well, we still have time, don't we? Dan remarked. The quest's time limit is 12 hours. It started this morning and we still have around 8 hours to go. I say we rest an hour or two, then get to business. If everything goes well, I say we can wipe them out in a few hours. Though, I have to tell you, I did a quick inventory and we don't have much firepower left. Only 2 grenades left, and something like 400 rounds collectively. Do we want to save them for Aquila or not? Rachna shook his head. Don't bother. One of your guns has around 20 to 30 attack value. I forgot to show it to you, so I might as well do it now, he uttered and prompted the system to share the status of Aquila with everyone around him. Lays breathed in sharply when he saw the numbers. No wonder you wanted help, he said, and the 3 people at his side nodded. Nix frowned at the status but other than that didn't seem to be visibly unsettled. Rachna shrugged. Conclusion, no need to save rounds. But keep those 2 grenades. The strength of the explosion may not be enough to injure it, but the blast might come in useful. Also, he added and waved his hand. His ring flashed and a pile of guns appeared to the side. These are the ones I took from Hearts. Serve yourself. Lays widened his eyes a bit at the sudden appearance of the firearms. He glanced at the ring around Rachna's finger but ultimately decided to not ask about it. Thank you. That will help. You don't want to keep some for yourself. Long story short, I hate guns. Lay's group blinked in surprise at his response. But, you're fine with giving them to us? Leia asked curiously. I don't like to project my moral stances onto others. You can use as many guns as you want, I won't mind as long as you're not some piece of trash using them to oppress others, Rachna said with a voice devoid of emotion. I see, Lays slowly nodded. Well, on the topic of not saving bullets, I'm okay with it. It's not like I can ignore this thing's monstrous defense and say that bullets will somehow be useful. It will be more worthwhile to use them on the eagles here. With this out of the way, I have to ask, Rachna glanced at Nix. Are you willing to help us or not? You have a weird sense of humor, she retorted blandly. Of course, I will. I'm already involved. It would just hurt my pride to back out now. Great, Lays said and stood up. In that case, let's resume the fighting in 1 hour and a half. It should be enough for everyone to recover well. No objection here, Rachna said and Lays' group went back to their gang. He then took out a second healing potion which he lobbed toward Alan who caught it with surprise. He looked at the small potion and gaped. You had a second one. I have 3. Same thing for the 2 other types. Alan groaned and raised his hand in surrender. All right. I hereby swear that I will never, ever, question anything you do anymore. You say that every month, Rachna retorted and Flavia giggled. Even Nix looked amused with the corner of her lips pulling slightly upward. In any case, drink that to heal your arm. We don't want one of our main fighters to be injured in due time. Yeah, thanks. You're welcome. Now, I'm going to take a nap. It has already been too long since the last one, Rachna said oddly seriously and Flavia flinched. Wake me up when it's time. Sure thing, Alan nodded and Nix closed her eyes in acknowledgement. Gray supported his chin with his hand as he sat on top of Aquila's head. The giant eagle didn't seem to care about it, at least that would be the first impression if one didn't pay attention to the faint twitches. So, those kids are ready to decimate all of the monsters even after I assembled all of them, the robot clown spoke with his mouth displaying a flat line. I guess you can't fight the power of an S+ potential, he mumbled. Doing more than this would be against the rules. And he still has those wolves under his command and he hasn't even transformed yet. Whoa. Aquila abruptly leaned to the side and Gray panicked as he started floating in front of the eagle's glaring eyes. Hey, calm down. I'm sorry, okay. It's not like there's a better seat anywhere close. You're both more comfortable and better placed than any other. Aquila huffed and opened his mouth. My head is most certainly not a place for you to rest and complain about your job. Meh, semantics. Also, lazy clown, I'm sensing more than just a werewolf down there, the divine avatar said. Gray tapped his head with his cane. Oh. Do you mean that girl? I don't know who you are referring to, but there's a divine presence in that building. Who is it? I thought you knew. Being an envoy and all. I thought that girl was a sort of scheme from the gods in order to do. I don't know, something. So, you don't know either, Aquila summarized and Gray shrugged. How peculiar though. What is? Her presence is divine, that is a fact. It is also true that her divine power is very weak. However, I would call that weakened rather than just weak. Even her soul seems to have been put under extreme harm and forcibly reduced to this state. Oh. Then by how much? I cannot tell. Then what is there to worry about? Gray spun on his feet to look down at the school. Maybe she's just the child of a god and a human. That would explain her odd power signature. You got me wrong, clown, Aquila scoffed. I'm saying that I can't tell from how high she could have fallen. In other words, her divine energy at her prime has high chances to be considerably stronger than what I can even perceive. Oh, indeed, clown. Indeed. Chapter 27. Nightmare. You are listening at novelfull.audio. My severed arm laid at my feet. Blood was slowly filling the pitch-black room and already went past my ankles. I raised my head and saw a mirror. My reflection stared back at me, bloodied, dead in every sense but physical. Then, the glass cracked and it stared back at me with a mad grin. The blood suddenly reached over my shoulder and I gasped. My reflection started laughing and I gradually lost every feeling across my entire body. I opened my mouth to breathe and shout, but the blood rushed in and I was silenced by the gargles before clawing at my throat. R.A. I heard a voice calling as I helplessly sunk. Rachna. Rachna's eyes snapped open and he immediately grabbed his throat. After he was sure that he could breathe normally, he gasped and started panting as sweat ran down his forehead. He rubbed his eyes and shook his dizziness away before looking around. Pronos was quite literally under his chin and seemed to be anxious for him. And if his very gloom appearance was anything to do by, the little guy's connection with his master had unluckily made him suffer a bit from the incident as well. Flavia was crouched next to him with worry written all over her face. Alan was also there, but in contrast, his expression expressed a certain disconsolate understanding instead of pure worry. Fortunately, the Windwalkers were too far away to have seen his little episode, but Nyx, who had not moved since earlier, was gazing at him with palpable sympathy cast under an appraising scowl. Rak, you're good. Alan spoke up and Rachna grunted as he scooped Pronos up and put him on his shoulder. He used the wall to stand up and groaned as he staggered a bit. Flavia was about to help him when he raised a hand to stop her. He huffed and leaned against the wall before taking out a cigarette and lighting it. He then wiped his sweat and combed his hair with his hand. In just a few seconds, he was back to a state where it would be impossible to tell that anything had happened. I'm fine. It's not the first time and it won't be the last anyway, he muttered and blew out a puff of smoke which, if you looked closely, had faint blue glimmers in it. Trauma? Nyx inquired without beating around the bush. She knew that she wasn't a very tactful person anyway, and she could easily tell that the man in question was someone who wouldn't feel offended by this simple question. Yeah, he replied indifferently, as expected. He grabbed his cigarette with 2 fingers and showed it to her. This thing, highly condensed medicine. But, let's be honest, it's quite literally a drug in the most straightforward meaning of the word. It was mainly meant to repress my mind from breaking apart when switching from one state to the other. But I also use it to stop the nightmares. He continued smoking as he cracked his sore neck. Normally, I try to never go too deep into REM sleep. That's why I'm used to taking naps so that I don't feel too tired. If I want to not have these nightmares, I have to sleep around 16 hours a day. I'm sure I don't need to explain to you how it was hard for me to do in these circumstances. Nick surprisingly sniggered. I can understand that. Then, the four of them fell silent until Lays called them from the other side of the gym. Everyone's ready to start. What about you guys? Ragnar burned through the rest of his cigarette with one inhale and threw it on the ground. He then casually walked away from the wall and stepped on it. Ready, he curtly said and unwrapped his scarf before transforming it into a bow. I'll join the people in the firing team up there. Pronos, Alan, you stay here to defend the entrance. Flavia, support every side. And, if you're willing to, you can do the same, Nix. The red-eyed woman nodded calmly. No need to worry. I will listen to your directives. I'm not a strategist myself. I will help your lady friend over here. I believe we can produce good results together. I agree, Flavia followed with a smile. Good to hear, Lays said and turned around. Guys. It's time. Get into position and prepare to open the west door first. If they ever break through the barricade to the south, split up as planned. Understood. Ragnar watched them spread out and followed the ones climbing the stairs placed to the side of the building to reach the glass panels. Pronos had already jumped out from his shoulder to take place on Alan's instead. When he reached the top of the stairs, he took a panel with no one in front and opened it without hesitating. He started pulling the string of Sonata and 3 iron arrows formed on it. The people next to him spectated in shock as he pulled the string back fully and released the 3 arrows at the same time. Each of them pierced an eagle flying in circles in the sky. Ragnar hummed, not bad. He looked at his hand and clenched it. It looked like after the fusion of his weaponry skills, his proficiency with the bow had indeed rocketed to a similar level as his spear mastery. Though, it wasn't as refined as it would be if he had reached that level of mastery by himself. He had been the first one to shoot, but the others couldn't just look at him. The wing walkers began to shoot at the eagles in single fire mode. One of them would shoot every 2 seconds or so to save as much ammo as possible. Meanwhile, the other group had cleared the barricade and waited patiently. After a minute or so, they could say for sure that there wasn't any monster on the other side. It had been an hour and a half since they got here, after all. They probably had given up. Lays slowly opened the door and looked from the left to the right through the gap. He nodded, then opened the doors wide. He then stepped back and allowed the others to have a clear view of the outside and several goblins. Shoot, he ordered with a calm voice, and whoever had a clear line of sight opened fire. The timing of this matched the moment when the eagle hunting team started firing as well. In just a few minutes, most goblins to the west side of the gym had been wiped out and at least 100 eagles had been shot down. Ragnar appraised the situation as he released another arrow that killed his 13th eagle. Sadly, he couldn't shoot as many as he would like to since Sonata only was able to generate an arrow every 12 seconds. At this rate, the goblins will easily be taken care of, he muttered to himself as he glanced at the west side through the windows. The guns were incredibly efficient to kill goblins, and considering how the others still alive were dumbly heading toward the entrance only to die meant that they would be soon done with. Yeah, but the eagles are another story, a voice said, and Ragnar looked at his right to see Dan walk toward him with a bow in his hand. I'm out of arrows for one and will soon be out of bullets. Not only that, even though there are a lot of eagles, we could still get help from the ladies down there to slowly cull them, but when the hobgoblins arrive, we'll be in trouble, he said and leaned against the glass panel with his arms crossed. Thanks to you, at least, they probably don't have a leader competent enough to lead them into a raid against us. But this will still be a bit annoying. It might take more time than planned. Rachna knocked another energy arrow and killed one eagle who had tried to plunge and then turn in his direction in midair. No need to worry, he said, and mentally commanded Sanada to turn back into a scarf, something that he was still pleasantly surprised he could do now. He still needed his case to kickstart it when it's a scarf, but other than that, the system would somehow hear his thoughts and change the weapon's form in consequences. What do you mean? Dan scowled. You'll see. He walked away from the window after closing it. He looked down at the inside of the gym and spotted his two friends plus Nyx calmly waiting for their turn to step in. Flavia, Nyx, he said with a voice that was neither loud nor quiet, but the two nonetheless heard him. When they turned their head to look at him, they each caught an object. The green is a stamina potion. Flavia, I noticed that your stamina goes down when you use your telekinesis. It might not fully heal your mind, but it should help, if just a bit. And Nyx, yours is a simple and effective mana potion. Hold on to it and use it when necessary. We will, thank you, Flavia smiled, and Nyx curiously looked at the liquid inside the tube in her hands. You have my thanks as well, she said. Much to my embarrassment, I couldn't buy one of these in the shop when prioritizing something else. Hey, nothing for me. Alan complained. You have Pronos with you. That's one of the best helps I can give you already, Rachna said, and walked back to the window where Dan was looking at him weirdly. What are you planning to do? Simple, he replied, and opened the glass panel wide. He put one foot on the ledge and looked at the spectacled teen. I'm going to do what I do best, he uttered, and jumped out. Dan watched in shock as he saw him transforming midair before landing on the ground outside in his wolf form. He then howled with everything he had and rushed toward one hobgoblin nearby as two LV.9 shadow wolves appeared at his side. After that, Dan saw dozens of grey wolves come out of the forest and attack goblins on sight as a shout from a growly voice echoed through the air. This time, it's not attrition. It's slaughter. Every wolf responded with a howl, and everyone back at the gym was dumbfounded, especially those who had witnessed Rachna jump out. And there he goes, Alan sighed. Then, as if on cue, he started hearing clicking sounds. He looked at the entrance to see the wing walkers retreating whilst dropping their now empty guns. Well, I guess it's time for us to go in. Agreed, Nyx was the first to move. The crowd at the entrance made room for her, and as soon as she had a view of the open door, she released a wave of shadow spikes that killed off the closest goblins in one strike, shaving off around 10% of her mana. Heh, Alan snickered and ran past her, directly getting out of the building. He charged at one confounded goblin and crushed its head. At the same time, he heard a notification telling him of his successful promotion to level 9, which he profited to allocate 2 points to speed and the remaining 2 he had saved up to strength. Following after him, Flavia came out of the gym and began to twist the neck of every eagle she saw and every goblin that came close to her. With her ability to now target several of them, a single glance could make 10 foes die instantaneously. Leigh's main team, composed of himself, Gant, Dan, and Leia, could only watch with a wry face. Do these guys even need us? Leia deadpanned and Gant laughed good-naturedly. We can't let them do all the job now, can we? He said, and stepped out with his shield in hand. Leigh smiled helplessly as Leia scoffed and rushed out with her hammer over her shoulder. He then schooled his expression and drew his katana before his silhouette blurred in a burst of speed. Dan sighed wearily and waved his bow, which then transformed into a knife attached to a string, the only item he had bought from the shop. He used the string to spin the knife around him before almost disappearing because of the speed of his movements. For the next hour, only the triumphant howls of wolves, the dying screeches of goblins, and the dull sounds of eagles hitting the ground could be heard. Chapter 28. Path. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ragnar jumped on the head of a hobgoblin while it was busy with his shadow wolves and extended his claws, which broke through the creature's skull and spilled to the ground matter worthy of censure. As the monster collapsed, Ragnar casually stayed on its head and hopped off of it the instant prior to it touching the ground. He looked around at the handiwork of both him, his shadow wolves, and the grey wolves and nodded in satisfaction. This time around, his little army was able to effectively hit the goblins since they were occupied with the commotion going on at the gymnasium. Ragnar then turned toward the sky and marveled at how the eagles seemed to be dragged toward the gym as if they were being siphoned by an invisible force. All of them had their praise locked on. He closed his eyes right after and sniffed the air. He still wasn't completely used to his new sense of smell, but one thing he had noticed was that he could discern between dead and alive. For instance, goblins smelled like dirt and cabbage, and when they'd die, it would turn extremely weak for a few minutes before disappearing and only leaving the stench of blood. Ragnar was not sure why they smelled like that, but he thought that maybe it was just his subconscious relating what he knew and saw to something familiar. Green, he muttered dumbly. If it truly was that, he was mad with himself for having made a connection between goblins and a vegetable just based on color. Anyhow, there are around 2 to 3 dozen goblins left. No hobs left. As for the eagles, he glanced at the sky once again and growled. Good thing is that their level stopped increasing and capped at level 6. He mused, and at the same time, his 2 shadow wolves happened to finish off a few goblins, which brought him a surprising prompt. LV.5 goblin killed. LV.5 goblin killed. Level up. +2 free points. S+ rank. +2 skill points. Requirement for level up updated. Current progress. 0/100. Before Ragnar could focus on the window, he felt a sudden rush of energy that rippled through his entire body. His eyes widened and he snarled quite loudly until it finally stopped. After the weird occurrence, he didn't feel any different, but another prompt proved him wrong. Core genome updated. 2 tails unlocked. Next tail. LV.10/LV.25 number of skills affected. 2 number of new skill attuned. 0 shape shift. A skill exclusive to the 9-tailed werewolf. Grants the ability to shift between 3 forms, wolf, speed +70%. +73%, werewolf, all attributes +50%. +53%, Thurian. Claws, LV.2. LV.8, extend and retract claws at will. +20. +80% attack. You have taken a step closer to the apex. Congratulations on reaching level 10. You have now the right to pick a path. This choice will impact your future development, the skills you will learn, your growth, your relations. After analysis of the host's potential, 10 paths have been singled out. Select one path. +10 magic attack, +20 MP, +0.1 MP regen. Path of the caster. +10 defense, +10 attack, +20 stamina. Path of the warrior. +10 swiftness, +10 agility, +10 senses. Path of the assassin. Uncommon. +30 attack, 0.10 defense, 0.20 MP. Path of the berserker. Rare. +10 attack, +20 magic attack, +10 MP. Path of the magic blade. Rare. +10 magic attack, +0.2 MP. regen. Path of the necromancer. Rare. +5 attack, +5 defense, +5 agility, +5 swiftness, +5 stamina. Path of the forger. Epic. +20 attack, +20 defense, +20 magic attack, +10 stamina, +10 MP. Path of the slayer. Epic. +30 defense, +20 senses, +30 stamina. Path of the guardian. Unique. +20 to all stats, +0.2 to MP. regen. Path of the Nine-Tailed Werewolf. Ragna's expression twitched. Let me breathe, would you like me to? No, keep it for later. Can I put this thing on hold? If yes, do it. I need to go back to the others to see if they need help, he said and kicked the ground. Coincidentally, his shadow wolves disappeared at the same time since their time was up, which was also followed up by a system prompt. Call of Fangs has increased to LV.2. The summoning time for the shadow wolves has been increased to 6 minutes. Ragna groaned and mentally dismissed the window. Most of these notifications were good things, but when they arrived one after another without delay, they became quite obnoxious. It took him approximately 2 minutes to return to the gym whilst finishing off the few goblins that were on his way. He passively noticed that his claws felt incredibly tougher and sharper compared to before. When he reached the building, he was on the opposite side of where the fighting was, but instead of going around, he ran toward the wall without slowing down and jumped as high as he could before landing vertically on the wall. He used his claws to stick to it and then continued his sprint. I have to be honest, he thought as he leaped over the wall to land on the roof. This feeling of freedom is addictive. He zoomed across the building's length and jumped off. While in midair, he took the opportunity to grab an eagle in his maw and 2 others with his tails before landing perfectly in the middle of the formation made by Lay's group and his own. Whoa! Alan almost tripped at his appearance, and he snorted before dropping the dead bird in his mouth and snapping the necks of the ones held by his tails, which were unexpectedly strong and quite maneuverable on top of being significantly longer than any normal wolf. Holy shit, where do you come from? His blonde friend asked the question that everyone around was thinking. I ran up the wall of the gym with my claws, Ragna replied as if it was the most normal thing ever. The group let out a chuckle and Leia threw a side remark with a huff, show off. That, I can't deny, Flavia also went along with a smile. Ragna has always been one to show off his skills. Whether it is intentional or not, however, is a mystery. Ragna humored their conversation with a grunt and turned back into a human in a second. He was getting used to the shift by now, and he was confident that he could soon reach a point where he could transform mid-battle without losing time. Pronos, who saw that his master was back, reclaimed his spot on his shoulder. For some reason, the little snake seemed to be pouting. What's wrong, little guy? Ragna asked as he casually drew Sonata as a bow and shot 2 arrows that killed an eagle each. I think he's a bit miffed that there isn't anything for him to do anymore, Alan replied. I'm on his side honestly. With the goblins wiped out, I can't really do anything with Nyx and Flavia killing every eagle that targets us. Lay shrugged. Same here, he said as his katana hanged loosely at his belt. He didn't even need his sword to kill the eagle, so it was resting in its scabbard. Same, Leia and Gant both added. On the other hand, Dan didn't really care, and his weapon had a bit more range to it than the others since it was a string knife. Thus, he could occasionally steal a few kills from the 2 powerhouses that were Flavia and Nyx. Understandable, Ragna commented and turned toward the people still shooting from the glass panels. They were still not completely out of ammunition, but it wouldn't last long. Though, you could say this is over already, he thought as he glanced at Flavia, who, although winded, appeared to be able to go on for a little longer. Then there was Nyx, who formed shadow constructs as easily as she breathed. She waved her hand and black spears and arrows would impale eagles left and right. I haven't used appraisal on her yet, have I? He suddenly remembered and didn't wait any further to use one of his favorite skills since he landed in this situation. Name. Nyx Nocta Regis Night Age. Level. 10, 32/100, Race. Ascended Human, originally A. Path. Not applicable titles. Former Goddess of the Night, former. Of Elysium, spared by the eternal night god potential. NR attributes. Strength. 4 endurance. 4 speed. 6 dexterity. 9 intelligence. 15 luck. 3 Statistics. Stamina. 2027 MP 95/150 Swiftness. 42 Agility. 24 Senses. 34 ATR Cap 41 Attack. 33 Defense. 16 Magic Attack. 45 MP Regen. 1.5 per minute proficiencies. Mana Control, LV Max, Mana Sense, LV Max, Enchant Weaving, LV.9, Crafting, LV.8, Magic Theory, LV.8, Weapon Mastery, LV.6, CQC, LV.6, Magic Skills. Requires Reawakening Cognitive Skills, Passive. Fatigue Resistance, LV-X, Fear Resistance, LV-X, Pain Resistance, LV-X, Moon's Blessing, LV-X. Spontaneous Skills, Active. Shadow Cloak, LV.3. Calls forth the elements of darkness in the air and allows the user to hide in shadows or to strengthen themselves. The darker it is, the more effective this skill is. Cost. 10.50 MP cooldown. 1H, Telepathy, LV.6. A simple skill to learn for those who already know how to shape mana within their body and mind. Allows communication between minds. Cost. Negligible. Maximum distance. 60 km Nirvana skills. Ascended Shadow Control, LV.2. The result of a powerful seal forced the host's power to be erased from its initial grandeur and degraded to a single skill. Though weak compared to where it came from, it is not to be underestimated as a Nirvana skill's growth is unlimited. Shadow Control allows the creation of physical shadow objects as well as a metaphysical manipulation of them. The strength, power, speed, or solidity of a construct depends on the mana pumped into it. Attack value will scale based on the magic attack stat and the minimum mana cost. Mana consumption grandly varies. Minimum mana cost. 1 MP Note. To keep a shadow construct active, a constant flow of mana is required. Unique or racial traits. Night Goddess. Divine Blood. Note. A former powerhouse that stood at the peak of the universe. She encountered the during the War of and was imprisoned in before being sealed away for years by the first until it recently was salvaged by the system. Unfortunately, Nixa's power had already been drained and erased over time. Yes.